Echoes of a Forgotten Truth. Part 1. The Bond of Friendship. Jack and Ethan had been best friends for as long as they could remember. In the quiet town of Riverbend, they were known as the inseparable duo. Wherever Jack went, Ethan followed, and wherever Ethan led, Jack was close behind. They shared everything: jokes, dreams, and even the same birthday. People often teased them, saying, "You two might as well be brothers." Jack lived with his parents, Mary and James, who ran a small bakery on Main Street. The scent of fresh bread and pastries filled their home every morning. Mary loved to hum old songs while baking, and James had a warm laugh that could make anyone smile. Jack adored them, but there were moments, late at night, when he felt a strange emptiness he couldn't explain. Ethan lived on the other side of Riverbend with his parents, Diane and Richard. Richard was strict and often preoccupied with his job at the bank. Diane, however, was gentle and soft-spoken, always tending to her flower garden. Ethan spent most of his time trying to live up to his father's high expectations, but he found comfort in Diane's quiet encouragement. One evening, as the summer sun dipped below the horizon, Jack and Ethan sat by the old bridge near the creek. The air was warm, and the sound of crickets filled the silence between them. Jack picked up a flat stone and skipped it across the water. "Do you ever feel like something's off?" Jack asked suddenly. Ethan glanced at him. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," Jack said, shrugging. Like you don't quite fit where you're supposed to." Ethan chuckled. "Jack, you're probably overthinking. You've got great parents, a great life. What's there to feel off about?" Jack smiled faintly, but he couldn't put the feeling into words. It was like a tiny voice in the back of his mind, whispering something he couldn't quite hear. A few days later, Jack was helping his mom organize the attic. Among the dusty boxes and old furniture, he came across a small, locked chest. He picked it up, curious, and showed it to Mary. "Oh, that's just old stuff from when you were a baby," she said quickly, reaching for it. "Can I see?" Jack asked, holding onto the chest. Mary hesitated before sighing. "All right, but there's nothing exciting in there." Jack opened the chest to find baby clothes, a rattle, and a hospital bracelet. He picked up the bracelet, frowning at the faded letters. Instead of his name, it read, "Baby Boy Carter." "That's weird," he said, showing it to his mom. Mary's face froze for a moment before she forced a smile. "Oh, that must be a mistake. Maybe they gave us the wrong bracelet at the hospital." Jack nodded, but something in her tone didn't feel right. Later that evening, Jack couldn't stop thinking about the bracelet. He pulled it out again, staring at the name, Carter. It didn't mean anything to him, but it felt like it should. The next day, Jack told Ethan about the bracelet. Ethan listened, leaning against their favorite tree near the creek. "That is kind of weird," Ethan said. "But it's probably just a mix-up, like your mom said." "Maybe," Jack said, though he didn't believe it. That night, Ethan was flipping through old family photos for a school project when he came across a picture of a nurse holding a newborn. The back of the photo had the date of his birth written on it, but what caught his attention was the name on the nurse's badge. Carter Memorial Hospital. Ethan stared at the photo, his heart racing. He remembered Jack's bracelet and the name written on it. The following afternoon, Ethan handed the photo to Jack, who stared at it in shock. "Ethan, this can't be a coincidence," Jack said. Ethan looked uneasy. "You think we were switched or something?" Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at the bracelet in his pocket and the photo in his hand. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I think we need to find out." Part 2. Questions without answers. The air was still as Jack and Ethan sat by the creek, their usual spot. But this time, the comfort of the place wasn't enough to ease the tension between them. Jack turned the bracelet over in his hands, while Ethan stared at the faded photo he had found the night before. "What do we even do?" Ethan finally asked, breaking the silence. "I think we have to ask our parents," Jack said. His voice was steady, but inside, he was nervous. "And say what?" "Hey, were we switched at birth?" Ethan laughed, but it was hollow. Jack didn't answer. He wasn't sure how to approach this either. Both boys sat quietly, their thoughts racing. The next morning, Jack decided to talk to his mom. He found her in the kitchen, kneading dough for the bakery. "Mom, can we talk?" Jack asked, sitting down at the table. Mary looked up and smiled. "Of course, honey. What's on your mind?" Jack hesitated. "It's about that hospital bracelet." Mary's hands froze for a second before she forced a laugh. "Jack, I told you it's just a mix-up. Hospitals make mistakes like that all the time." "But, Mom, what if it's not a mistake?" Jack pressed. "What if there's more to it?" Mary wiped her hands on a towel and sat down across from him. "Jack, you've always been my son. Nothing will ever change that." Her words were kind, but they didn't answer his question. Jack nodded, but as he walked away, he felt like she was hiding something. Meanwhile, Ethan had his own questions for his mom. He waited until the evening, when Diane was watering her flowers in the garden. "Mom, can I ask you something weird?" Ethan began, leaning against the porch railing. Diane smiled. "Of course, sweetie. What is it?" "It's about this photo," Ethan said, holding it up. "The nurse's badge says, Carter Memorial. Did I really come from there?" Diane's face paled, but she quickly turned away, pretending to adjust a plant. "Yes, you were born there." "Why do you ask?" Ethan hesitated. "It's just..." Jack found something with the same name. "It's strange, don't you think?" Diane's hands trembled slightly as she placed the watering can down. "Ethan, sometimes things seem strange when they're not. You don't need to worry about this." Ethan frowned. "But..." "Enough, Ethan," Diane said, her voice unusually sharp. "This isn't something you need to think about." Ethan didn't argue, but he knew she wasn't telling the whole truth. That night, Jack and Ethan met again at their creek. "They're lying," Jack said bluntly as soon as Ethan arrived. Ethan nodded. "I think so too. My mom wouldn't even look me in the eye." "What now?" Jack asked. Ethan sat down, running his hands through his hair. "I don't know. But I feel like we're not going to get answers from them." Jack thought for a moment. "What if we find out on our own?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "How? It's not like we can just ask the hospital." "Why not?" Jack said, his eyes lighting up with determination. "There has to be a record, right? Something about us being born there." Ethan hesitated. "You really think they'll just hand over that kind of information?" "We won't know until we try," Jack said. The next day after school, they biked to the library. They weren't sure what they were looking for, but they knew they had to start somewhere. Jack pulled up a map of the town and pointed to Carter Memorial Hospital, which was located just a few miles away. "Look," he said, "this place is still running. If they have records, we can ask for them." Ethan looked uncertain. "And what if they don't give them to us?" Jack shrugged. "We'll figure it out." Later that evening, Jack sat in his room, staring at the bracelet. His mind was filled with questions. Who am I? Why did this happen? And why won't anyone tell us the truth? The following morning, Jack and Ethan rode their bikes to Carter Memorial. The hospital was old, with peeling paint and faded signs, but it was still busy with nurses and doctors moving in and out. Jack took a deep breath as they walked through the glass doors. A receptionist sat behind the desk, typing on a computer. She looked up and smiled. "Can I help you boys?" she asked kindly. Yeah," Jack said, glancing at Ethan. "We were hoping to see some birth records from 15 years ago." The woman's smile faded slightly. "I'm sorry, but those records are private. We can't share them without a parent's permission." Jack's heart sank. "Is there any other way we can see them?" The receptionist shook her head. "Not without permission." "I'm sorry." As they walked out of the hospital, Ethan muttered, "Well, that was a bust." Jack stopped and turned to him. "Not yet. We'll find another way." Ethan looked at him skeptically. "What do you mean?" Jack's eyes narrowed. "We're not giving up, Ethan. Someone in there knows the truth, and we're going to find it." The boys stood there, staring at the hospital, as if it held all the answers they were searching for. But they had no idea just how deep the mystery would go, or how much it would change their lives forever. Part 3. Unlocking the Past. Jack and Ethan couldn't stop thinking about their visit to Carter Memorial. The hospital had felt like a wall, one that held all the answers but wouldn't let them in. That night, Jack lay in bed staring at the bracelet again. The name Carter seemed to whisper to him, almost like a key waiting to unlock a door. He turned the idea over and over in his mind until something clicked. The next morning, Jack met Ethan by the creek, their usual meeting spot. Ethan looked tired, with dark circles under his eyes. "You didn't sleep either, did you?" Jack asked. Ethan shook his head. I kept thinking about that hospital. What if there's more to this than we thought? There has to be, Jack said firmly. And I think I know how we can find out. Ethan raised an eyebrow. How? Jack leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. We sneak in. Ethan's eyes widened. Sneak into the hospital? Are you crazy? We'll get caught. Not if we're careful, Jack said. Look, the receptionist said the records are private. That means they're somewhere inside. We just need to figure out where. Ethan hesitated. Breaking into a hospital wasn't exactly something he had ever imagined doing. But Jack's determination was infectious, and deep down, Ethan wanted answers just as much as his friend. All right, Ethan said finally. But if we get in trouble, this was your idea. Jack grinned. Deal. That evening, the boys met behind the hospital, dressed in dark clothes. The area was quiet, with only a few dim lights illuminating the parking lot. Are you sure about this? Ethan whispered. Jack nodded. We'll be in and out. No one will even know we were here. They found an unlocked window near the back of the building. Jack pushed it open and climbed through, landing softly on the floor inside. Ethan followed, his heart pounding in his chest. The hallway was dimly lit and eerily quiet. Jack pulled out a small flashlight and whispered, "Stay close." They crept down the hall, their footsteps barely making a sound. Jack's heart raced as he scanned the doors, looking for any sign of where the records might be kept. After what felt like an eternity, they found a door marked Archives. Jack tried the handle, but it was locked. Now what? Ethan whispered. Jack pulled a small paperclip from his pocket. I saw this in a movie once, he said with a grin. You've got to be kidding me, Ethan muttered. Jack fiddled with the lock, his hands shaking slightly. After a few tense moments, there was a soft click, and the door swung open. See, Jack whispered. Piece of cake. Inside, the room was filled with shelves of old files and boxes. The air was thick with the smell of dust and paper. Okay, Jack said. We're looking for records from 15 years ago. They began searching the shelves, their fingers brushing against the faded labels on the boxes. After several minutes, Ethan pulled out a file labeled Births 15 years ago. Jack, I think I found it, Ethan whispered. Jack rushed over and they opened the file together. Inside were pages of handwritten records. They scanned the names, their hearts pounding with each one. Finally, they found it. Two names stood out, Baby Boy Carter and Baby Boy Henderson. Jack's breath caught in his throat. That's it, he said, pointing at the names. Ethan stared at the paper, his mind racing. So, I was Baby Boy Henderson, and you were Baby Boy Carter. Jack nodded, his hands trembling. Ethan, this means we were switched. Before they could process what they had found, they heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Someone's coming, Ethan whispered urgently. Jack quickly stuffed the file back onto the shelf. Let's go. They slipped out of the room and ran back the way they had come, their hearts pounding with fear. As they reached the window, Jack paused for a moment, looking back down the hallway. "Jack, come on," Ethan hissed. Jack climbed through the window, and they ran into the night, not stopping until they were far from the hospital. Back at the creek, the boys sat catching their breath. "We did it," Ethan said, his voice shaky. "But now what?" Jack asked, holding the photo and bracelet tightly in his hands. Ethan looked at him, his expression serious. "We have to tell our parents. There's no hiding this anymore." Jack nodded. "But what if they don't believe us?" "They'll have to," Ethan said firmly. "This is too big to ignore." As the sun began to rise over the horizon, the boys knew their lives had changed forever. They had found the truth, but they were only beginning to understand what it meant. Part 4. The Truth Hurts. The next morning, Jack woke up feeling like his world had flipped upside down. He couldn't stop thinking about the hospital records. Everything he knew about himself, his family, his life, felt like a lie. Jack wasn't sure how to bring it up to his mom. She was in the kitchen, humming as she made breakfast. Her smile was warm, as it always was, but Jack felt a pang in his chest. "Mom," he said, sitting at the table. His voice was quiet, but she turned to him right away. "What is it, honey?" she asked, wiping her hands on a towel. Jack hesitated, gripping the edge of the table. "I went to Carter Memorial yesterday." The color drained from Mary's face. "You what?" "Ethan and we found something," Jack said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the photo and bracelet. "Mom, these are proof. I wasn't supposed to be your son." Ethan was. Mary's hands trembled as she sat down across from him. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then she sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I hoped this day would never come," she said softly. Jack's heart raced. "So it's true." Mary nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Jack, it wasn't our choice. We didn't know until it was too late." "What happened?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mary took a deep breath. "When you boys were born, there was a mix-up at the hospital. They didn't realize it until months later. By then, we had already bonded with you. They gave us a choice. Switch you back or keep things the way they were." Jack stared at her in disbelief. "And you chose to keep me?" Mary reached for his hand, but he pulled it away. "Jack, we loved you. You were our son, no matter what." Jack stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "You should have told me," he yelled, his voice breaking. "You've been lying to me my whole life." "Jack, please," Mary pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "We didn't mean to hurt you. We thought it was for the best." But Jack couldn't listen. He stormed out of the house, his mind racing. At the same time, Ethan was having a similar conversation with his mom. Diane was in the garden, trimming the roses, when Ethan approached her. "Mom, we need to talk," Ethan said, holding the hospital file tightly. Diane turned to him with a smile, but it quickly faded when she saw his serious expression. "What's wrong?" she asked. Ethan held out the file. "I know the truth. Jack and I were switched at birth." Diane froze, the clippers slipping from her hands. "Ethan, why didn't you tell me?" Ethan demanded, his voice shaking. "Why did you keep this from me?" Diane sighed and sat down on the porch steps. "Ethan, it's not as simple as you think." "Then explain it to me," Ethan said, his voice rising. Diane looked at him, her eyes filled with sadness. "When the hospital told us about the mistake, we were devastated. But by then you were our son. We couldn't imagine giving you up." "So you just decided to ignore it?" Ethan asked, his fists clenched. Diane shook her head. "We thought it was the right thing to do. We didn't want to lose you." Ethan stared at her, his chest tight with anger and hurt. "You should have told me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I had a right to know." "I'm sorry, Ethan," Diane said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry." But Ethan couldn't stay. He turned and walked away, feeling like his whole world was falling apart. Jack and Ethan met at the creek later that afternoon. Neither of them spoke at first. They just sat side by side, staring at the water. "My mom admitted it," Jack finally said. "Mine too," Ethan replied. Jack picked up a stick and threw it into the creek. "I don't know what to think anymore. Everything I thought was true. It's all a lie." Ethan nodded. "Same. I feel like I don't even know who I am." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their discoveries pressing down on them. "What do we do now?" Jack asked. Ethan shrugged. "I don't know. But I feel like we can't just leave it like this." Jack looked at him, his eyes filled with determination. "We have to know the whole truth. There's more to this than what they're telling us." Ethan nodded. "But how do we find out?" Jack thought for a moment. The hospital records were just the start. If they knew about the switch, there has to be more records, more people who know. Ethan hesitated. "You mean, go back to the hospital?" Jack nodded. "Yeah. But this time, we're not leaving until we get the answers we need." Ethan took a deep breath. "All right. Let's do it." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the two boys made a pact. They would uncover the truth, no matter what it took. Part 5. Buried Secrets. Jack and Ethan spent the next few days preparing for their return to Carter Memorial. The first time had been a rushed, risky attempt. This time they wanted to be smarter. They borrowed an old map of the hospital layout from the library, hoping it might guide them. "Look," Jack said, pointing to the map. "There's a basement level. It says records and storage. We didn't check there last time." Ethan nodded, studying the map. If they're keeping old records, that's probably where they'd be. They decided to go back late at night, hoping the hospital would be quieter. The hospital parking lot was nearly empty when they arrived. A few dim lights flickered outside the building, casting long shadows. Jack and Ethan crept around to the back, where they had found the unlocked window before. "Do you think it'll still be open?" Ethan whispered. "Only one way to find out," Jack replied. They reached the window, and Jack pushed gently. It slid open, just like last time. He climbed through, landing softly on the floor, and helped Ethan in after him. The hospital was eerily quiet, with only the faint hum of machines breaking the silence. Jack pulled out his flashlight, keeping the beam low to avoid drawing attention. "Let's find the stairs," he whispered. They followed the map, their footsteps muffled on the tiled floor. The air felt colder as they moved deeper into the building. Finally, they reached a stairwell that led to the basement. Jack hesitated, looking down the dark staircase. "Ready?" Ethan took a deep breath. "Let's go." The basement was nothing like the rest of the hospital. The air was damp, and the walls were lined with old shelves and cabinets. Dim lights flickered above, casting eerie shadows. "This place feels wrong," Ethan muttered. Jack ignored him, focusing on the shelves. They were packed with boxes and files, each labeled with dates and numbers. "Start looking," Jack said. "We need anything from around the time we were born." They split up, searching through the dusty files. Jack's hands shook as he flipped through the pages, the old paper crackling under his fingers. "Found something," Ethan called out, holding up a folder. Jack rushed over, and they opened the folder together. Inside were pages of hospital records, each one more unsettling than the last. One document stood out, a formal report detailing the mix-up in the maternity ward 15 years ago. It described how 2 baby boys had been switched due to a labeling error. But there was more: notes about a meeting between the hospital staff and the families involved. Jack's eyes scanned the page. It says both families were told about the mistake. But look, there's a name here: Dr. Richard Gale. He was in charge of the maternity ward at the time. Ethan frowned. "Do you think he's still around?" Jack shrugged. "Only one way to find out." Before they could read further, they heard footsteps echoing down the hallway. "Someone's coming," Ethan hissed. Jack stuffed the folder into his backpack, and they hid behind a shelf. The footsteps grew louder, and a flashlight beam swept across the room. "Is someone there?" a man's voice called out. Jack held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The flashlight moved closer, and he could see the shadow of a man in a security uniform. Ethan grabbed Jack's arm, mouthing, "We have to go." Jack nodded, and they waited until the guard turned away before slipping out of the room. They moved quickly but quietly, making their way back up the stairs and out through the same window. Outside, they ran until they were far from the hospital. They stopped in a small park, panting and leaning against a tree. "We got it," Jack said, pulling the folder from his backpack. Ethan stared at it. "What now?" "We find Dr. Gale," Jack said. "He's the only one who can tell us the full story." The next day, Jack and Ethan searched online for any information about Dr. Richard Gale. It didn't take long to find a listing for a small clinic on the edge of town. This has to be him, Ethan said, pointing at the screen. Jack nodded. Let's go. The clinic was a modest building with peeling paint and a faded sign. Inside, the waiting room was empty except for a receptionist behind a desk. "Can I help you?" she asked. "We're here to see Dr. Gale," Jack said. The receptionist raised an eyebrow. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but it's really important," Ethan said. She hesitated, then picked up the phone. After a brief conversation, she nodded. "He'll see you. Second door on the left." Jack and Ethan exchanged a glance and walked to the door. Inside, an older man with gray hair and glasses sat behind a desk. He looked up as they entered, his expression wary. "Can I help you?" he asked. Jack took a deep breath and held up the folder. "We need to talk about Carter Memorial." 15 years ago, Dr. Gale's face paled, and he leaned back in his chair. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," Jack said firmly. "We found the records. We know about the switch." Dr. Gale sighed, running a hand through his hair. "That was a long time ago. I'm not sure what you expect me to say." "We want the truth," Ethan said. "Why did it happen? And why didn't anyone fix it?" Dr. Gale hesitated, then gestured for them to sit down. "What I'm about to tell you," he said, his voice low, "is something I've tried to forget, but you deserve to know." Part 6. The Truth Revealed. Dr. Gale took a deep breath and stared at the two boys sitting across from him. His hands were shaking slightly, but he kept his voice steady as he began to speak. "It all started on the night you two were born. It was late, and the hospital was understaffed. There was a mix-up in the maternity ward, and the labels on the babies were switched. The nurses were tired, and in the chaos of the night shift, they made a mistake. 2 babies were placed in the wrong cribs." Jack and Ethan listened in silence, their minds racing. It was everything they had suspected, but hearing it from Dr. Gale made it feel even more real. The staff immediately realized the mistake the next morning, but by then, both families had already been told that their babies were born healthy and well. Dr. Gale continued, "It was too late to change things without causing panic and distrust. The hospital made the decision to keep the mix-up quiet. Both families were told that it was a mistake, but they were told it was a small error and that it would be corrected." Jack's voice shook with anger. "So why didn't you fix it? Why didn't you tell our families the truth?" Dr. Gale lowered his gaze. "Because we were scared. Scared of what it would do to the families. Scared of the lawsuits that might follow, and scared of the damage to the hospital's reputation. We thought it would be easier to let things go. But it was a terrible mistake, and I've regretted it ever since." Ethan's fists were clenched in his lap. "So you let us grow up in the wrong families? You let us live a lie?" Dr. Gale nodded slowly. "Yes. I was part of it. I should have done more, but at the time, I thought it was the right decision. It wasn't." Jack stood up, pacing the room. "You think telling us this is enough? You think this makes it right?" Dr. Gale stood too, looking guilty but calm. "I know it's not enough, but I want to help you now. I can't change the past, but I can try to make things right. You deserve to know who you really are. Your families deserve to know the truth." Ethan looked at Jack, and for the first time in days, there was a look of understanding between them. They had come this far, and now they had the truth. But the truth brought new questions. "What do we do now?" Jack asked, his voice softer. Dr. Gale seemed to consider this. "First, I'll help you get in touch with your real families. They deserve closure. 2. I can give you the names of the people who worked in the hospital back then, and maybe they can help track down any paperwork that's still available." Ethan nodded. "And what about the other families? How will they react when they find out?" Dr. Gale sighed deeply. "It won't be easy for anyone. The families have lived with the idea that their children are someone else's. It may take time for them to accept the truth, and it may cause pain. But the truth is important. You need to meet your real families. You need to know who you are." Jack's anger softened, replaced with a quiet sadness. "I've always known something wasn't right. My whole life has felt like a dream, like I was always looking for something but never finding it." Ethan agreed. "I never felt like I really fit in. My whole life, I wondered who I was, but I didn't know how to ask, or if I should ask. Now I'm glad we did." Dr. Gale looked at them both. "You should be proud. The search for the truth takes courage. But I promise you, once you find your real families, things will start to make sense. You'll understand why things happened the way they did." Jack and Ethan stood up together. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. There were still many questions, many emotions to deal with, but they had the answers they needed. They now had a path to follow. "Thank you for telling us the truth," Ethan said quietly. Dr. Gale nodded, his face serious. "I'm sorry for everything, and I'll help you however I can." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. With Dr. Gale's help, Jack and Ethan tracked down the old hospital records, and after some searching, they were able to find the names of their real families. The journey wasn't easy. They had to contact old doctors, make phone calls, and wait for answers. When they finally met their real families, it was both strange and overwhelming. Jack was introduced to his biological mother, a kind woman named Carol, who had never known he was out there. She was shocked, but the love in her eyes was undeniable. Ethan met his father, Mark, who had spent years wondering what had happened to his son. The reunion was filled with tears, hugs, and awkward silences, but it was also filled with healing. Jack and Ethan found themselves learning new things about themselves, things they had never known before. Their birth families had their own challenges to work through. There was hurt and confusion, but there was also a lot of love. The truth had come out, and while it didn't erase the years lost, it opened new doors for both boys and their families. For Jack and Ethan, life would never be the same. They had a lot to figure out. They still had to navigate their relationships with their original families, and they needed time to process everything. But they were no longer lost. They had found the missing pieces. And as they sat together one evening, looking at the photos of their real families, Jack looked at Ethan and smiled. "I guess we don't have to keep searching anymore," he said. Ethan smiled back. "No, we don't." And with that, they knew their lives were finally on the path they were meant to follow. They had faced the darkest mystery of all, who they truly were, and they had come out stronger on the other side. That's the end of the story. If you enjoyed the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more exciting tales. Check out our other videos and share your thoughts in the comments. Stay tuned for the next adventure. Thanks for watching.